Hello everybody, here we are today doing our season preview of the Toronto Maple Leafs, talking about whether or not the Leafs actually have something going for them this year. So before we get started with it, please make sure to subscribe if you're new to me or hockey, whatever the case may be. That being said, let's get on into it. So last season, Toronto finished with 102 points and ended up making the playoffs for a ninth straight year. But like we've seen so many times over this 9-year run, they lose early in the playoffs, and this one was to the Boston Bruins, their arch rivals, as they lost in 7 games. Sheldon Keefe ends up getting fired. That is a big decision to make, but I feel like this year too, if things don't really work out for them, there could be even more big decisions to make. So it's not like there's a huge transition from being pessimistic to optimistic. There's still a lot of pessimism here, and you're just wondering exactly how things will go for this side. But I do think on paper, this team could look a little bit better than even what we saw last year. So there's a lot swirling around for this side. They've had a lot of time to play golf and reminisce about what could have been, but we're thinking about what can be. So what are some storylines for the Leafs for this season? So the first storyline is talking about whether or not having a Stanley Cup winning head coach even matters. And looking at this is a valid question. I know that when I did my season preview for the Seattle Kraken, I talked about how it actually was a big deal for Seattle to be able to get a guy like Ken Bylsma, who is a Cup winning head coach. And while I said I don't necessarily think that he's going to get them to where he had the Pens at one stage in his coaching career, it is kind of a big get in for this organization as they get a Cup winner. But I think for Toronto, it's totally different, as the organization's expectations are higher and their history is clearly much richer. In looking at this, they go out and get Craig Berube, which is kind of interesting because right off the bat, you hear the media talk about, yeah, they get a Cup-winning head coach that knows how to get the job done come playoff time. But I already kind of see a big hole in that logic. And the problem here is the fact they've already tried to go out there and get guys that have won the Stanley Cup as head coaches. Just thinking back to Mike Babcock, who ended up winning the Cup with the Detroit Red Wings in 08, Randy Carlyle, who won the Cup with the Ducks in 07, and even guys that didn't go on to win the Cup that made it to the Stanley Cup final that were their head coach at some point or another. Looking at guys like Ron Wilson, who took the Capitals to the Stanley Cup final in 1998, who lost to the Red Wings. Paul Maurice, who took the Hurricanes to the Stanley Cup final in 2002, lost to the Red Wings, kind of sensing a trend there. And then you had Pat Quinn, who ended up taking the Canucks to the Stanley Cup final in 1994, who lost to the New York Rangers in 7 games, heartbreaking. But anyway, I kind of digress. You're seeing 5 relatively recent head coaches for the Toronto side, and they have either made it there and won it, or they were nearly on the verge of winning it. But you notice a trend there. All with other teams, never with this team. And that's where I don't really think that this is going to be a huge deal one way or the other. Yes, Berube has been able to rally St. Louis side and he had good years there, but it's all about what he does in Toronto at this point. So having a Stanley Cup winning coach is kind of nice to say, hey, maybe he could be helping us out to get there. But again, with Toronto looking at what they've done before, it doesn't really necessarily mean things are going to go perfectly. If this was something that was so easy to fix, Toronto's got the money. They would just keep throwing cash at the problem to get things solved. So the second storyline is talking about whether or not Toronto's had some fun poaching Panthers. And what exactly do I mean by this? Well, I mean that Toronto's been able to go out and get some players that were on Florida's playoff roster, and it could probably end up benefiting them while hurting the Panthers, kind of the addition by subtraction. These two teams don't really like each other. They've met before in the 2023 playoffs when a lot of people, including myself, thought, man, Toronto might be able to go on to a conference final at least, and started to see maybe Matthews appears in the Stanley Cup final. Wasn't meant to be, as the Panthers made it to the final in 23 before winning it in 24, and Toronto saw some of those guys that were on that roster and said, yeah, we would like to pick him up. They got Ulrich McLarsson, who I've talked about before. OEL is a player that kind of is in a little bit of a career resurgence after people kind of dogged on him a little bit, but he's in a spot right now where he joins an experienced blue line where he could probably help come playoff time especially, and just try to get this side over the hump. Not going to be something where he is going to be a star, but him and Tanev and some of these other players on that blue line kind of intrigued me a little bit about what they could be. And then you look at a guy like Anthony Stolarz. He had a really, really good year last year for the Panthers. 2.03 goals against average and a .925 save percentage, I think. Those are both fantastic numbers, and it's a big year for probably the netminders in Toronto because you have Joseph Woll, who is young, and you're kind of wondering if he can be that guy. And the good thing is you go out there and get somebody that probably could at the very least be a good backup for him. Not saying that the numbers are going to be perfect or again near that 2 for your goals against average, but even if he was able to be a reliable backup, fantastic news, or just kind of a 1A, 1B, as well as young and trying to get the ropes, getting more games underneath him, and again, dealing with the pressure of the Toronto environment. Now, I don't necessarily think these are going to be moves that totally move them across to say that they are the ultimate Stanley Cup favorite at the moment, but it's clear from what we're seeing here, Toronto gets a little bit better while Florida theoretically gets a little bit worse. For two teams that could meet again in the playoffs, this would maybe be the difference maker and be a fun storyline come playoff time, especially if these two players decide how this series goes. And I do want to add too, again, Spencer Knight is going to be the backup for Florida, so maybe things are going to be okay there, as Knight is touted as somebody that could be the future starter for the Panthers. But still, like we've talked about with Anthony, you hate to see a guy that has great numbers like that go on to another team, especially a division rival, and that's all I'll say. And then the third and final storyline is talking about whether the Mitch Marner drama impacts the team in a negative way. Mitch Marner has been a mainstay for this team for a long time and has been part of what they've been able to achieve over this period. But I think at the same time too, Marner kind of encapsulates what we've seen from this team before, where the fans love them, especially when it comes to the regular season, but then when it comes to the playoffs, they are the villains. And I think in the case for Marner, he is a villain in Toronto in a lot of ways. The fans seem to pick on him a lot, especially during the playoffs, and he's kind of the scapegoat. There's been multiple scapegoats for Toronto over the years, but for Marner, you can kind of see why some of the things transpired the way they did. It wasn't him that had that bad turnover in that series where they were up 3-1 against Montreal before the Habs would go on and beat them and make it to the Stanley Cup final. Things like that people look back at, and it's just really, really bad to see because Marner has been such an impactful player for them. But at the same time, too, when you flick the puck over the end of the glass and then you take a penalty and your team goes on to lose a series, especially when you haven't won a lot over the years, people tend to focus in on those moments. And then in this series against the Boston Bruins this year, with him, Nylander, and just how things kind of transpired on the bench against Boston, it felt very awkward and it felt like this was going to be the nail in the coffin. I really thought with him having a year left on his deal, he was going to be on his way out. Instead, it looks like he will play his final year in Toronto at the very least. But there is room for him to try to work out a contract. But I think it's just very awkward at the moment too, because people are talking about, could he get a deal done during the regular season? Maybe he could, but I don't really see why they would go out there and try to do that unless they really did buy into what he was going to be as part of this long-term future. Even though at this stage we're kind of in a weird spot with how much future do they have. And in my eyes, I think Marner's deal is going to come with how they perform in the playoffs. If Marner has a good series and the team goes on to a Eastern Conference final appearance, he's going to get that extension. But if the team advances and he has a bad series, or even if he has a bad series and the team loses earlier, especially I should say, Marner's probably done in Toronto. Not necessarily the worst thing for both sides too, is Toronto get to move around some money and figure out how they want to change this roster a little bit, while another team that has a lot of cash to throw would probably be able to go out there and get him and improve themselves. I had a buddy that I work with that's a huge Chicago Blackhawks fan, and he talked about maybe trying to go out there and get Marner as the Hawks are trying to turn this team around. They should have the cash to be able to get that all resolved. But this still kind of circulates again to how things will go for Marner come April and May and maybe even June with the Leafs, as this really could be the last big push for him in his Leafs legacy. And what I gotta say with that is I do think this could impact the team negatively, especially come playoff time, as some of that chemistry or more of that confliction, I will say, is something that I do worry about here, as it just seems like they could turn on each other as frustration has mounted over and over and over again. And Marner just could be, again, that scapegoat before he's actually finally gone. So overall, what are my thoughts on the Toronto Maple Leafs? Well, they are a team that looks set to make the playoffs for a 9th straight year. I apologize, earlier I said they had made it 9 years. It's actually been 8. But, again, looking at all of this, they've been really good, but they have failed come playoff time. And that's what it's all about. This isn't soccer where the regular season is everything. A lot of leagues, most leagues over in Europe don't even have a playoff system or whatever. Their championship is decided during the regular season. If that was the case, Toronto would kind of be in a good spot. But this is really what it's all about for North American sports, is winning in the playoffs. Toronto hasn't done that. And I think they're in very dangerous territory here. Somebody tweeted that Austin Matthews was the same age as JT when he signed with the Leafs on the deal after he left the Islanders. That is mortifying, knowing how much time Matthews has played for this team and nothing has been done. There's not really been anything to say we can look back at and be proud of that. I know there are some things, but it's just very concerning about where this team is. But at the same time, too, I feel optimistic about this side. They keep getting there, and I feel like they actually have the talent to get the job done. Let's just hope the playoffs are something where things actually change. The power play is able to improve, the stars shine, the stars don't get injured or disappear or, have a bunch of infighting going on. I don't really know. But yeah, they're going to make the playoffs this year. It's more about what happens and how dramatic will things be. So anyway, what are your thoughts on the Leafs for this season? Let me know down below in the comments. Also, please make sure to like this video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you're new. Everybody stay safe. Have a great night. And you love hockey already. Goodbye, Brigadiers and Brigadettes. This is your captain signing off. Have a great night.